We're going to go ahead and get started with the second panel of speakers. It is my privilege to introduce the moderator for our second panel of speakers today, Professor Matt Lampkin. Professor Lampkin joined the TU College of Law after 2 years as a fellow at Stanford Law School's Center for Law and the Biosciences. Prior to entering academia, he was in private practice in Chicago and Illinois, clerked for a federal judge, and worked as a policy advisor to the mayor of Indianapolis. Professor Lampkin's scholarship explores the intersection of healthcare, law, and ethics, with a particular focus on how the increasing commercialization of medical care is reshaping our understanding of disease and disability, informed consent and personal responsibility, and the role of government in regulating medical care. Please join me in welcoming Professor Matt Lampkin.
Our next speaker is Glenn Cohen. He is a professor of law at Harvard Law School. He's also co-director of the Petrie-Flom Center and a leading expert on the intersection of bioethics and the law. His scholarship has included projects on medical tourism, reproductive technology, end-of-life decision-making, and research ethics. I am told by people who have had an opportunity to see Glenn work that he will disappear behind his office door for a few hours and emerge with a fully formed law review article. Judging from the list of publications, that seems to be true. His work has appeared in the New England Journal of Medicine, the Journal of Law, Medicine, and Ethics, and a raft of law reviews, including Stanford, Georgetown, USC, and many others. Glenn has a BA from the University of Toronto and a JD from Harvard Law School, and today he's going to be speaking on biomedical enhancement technologies.
Thank you very much, and thank you to the law school and to the law review for bringing us here. It's my first time in Oklahoma, and I'm really, really enjoying it. But I want to subtract 10% of the thank you from Matt Lampkin for the following reason. It is a punishment to have to finish. I had to follow Tala Sayed, right? When I was first, I was confident that I would sound okay, but I will slavishly need to look at my notes in a way that he doesn't. He can just keep going and give you a lecture about a grand theory of healthcare distribution. But at least I have a full 4 hours, I think, before Einar speaks. So at least I'm ahead of Einar on the queue, and I say this for the following reason. Einar is just brilliant. I try as hard as I can to be good at my field. Einar is a master of 4 fields: antitrust, contracts, statutory interpretation, and of course health law and bioethics, which we're talking about now, right? The polite way of putting this is when he enters the room, the average IQ goes up dramatically. The less polite way of putting it, which is the way I usually feel, is that in every conversation we ever have, I am acutely aware that I'm not as smart as I think I am, because he is way smarter. Einar, you are a wonderful mentor to me. You've been a wonderful friend, and I just wish those of you who don't know Einar that you can have someone in your life who will do the kinds of things for you and help you in your life and your career the way Einar has for me, because it's really, really a privilege to get to honor you today. Okay, so with that said, I've made a smart decision, and the decision, I think it's smart. You'll tell me if it's smart or not. What I think the smart decision to take is I'm going to riff on something Einar hasn't published yet. And that way you won't know how much what I say suffers by comparison to what he's working on, right? So he has an unpublished book on enhancement called Reengineering Humans, What Limits, that's still kind of being toyed with. And I'm going to give my views of enhancement and riff a little bit on his own. So I'm going to start by offering what I call a reconstructive taxonomy of enhancements. Those who know me, they often say in legal academia there are splitters and there are joiners. I'm definitely a splitter, right? I've never seen a problem that was complex that I couldn't make more complex, and that's what I'm going to do at first by breaking it up. The second thing I'm going to do is I'm going to offer a taxonomy of legal and regulatory interventions. And then I'm going to try to sketch some of the major arguments and my thoughts on them as to what's wrong with enhancement. And I think the more novel thing is a question that's not often asked is, what is right with enhancement, right? So let's start. Okay. So this is my attempt to try to map out all of enhancement discourse in one slide, which is always fun, right? So I begin by trying to divide biological versus non-biological enhancement. When people talk about enhancement, I think they often have biology in mind, but there's lots of non-biological enhancements. All learning, all training, LSAT tutoring for prospective law students, for example, that is an enhancement. Sometimes these non-biological enhancements take the form of add-ons rather than alterations. So Google Glass, when it comes out, I think is a good example of an add-on that is a non-biological enhancement. And sometimes the link, I think, between these add-ons versus actually alterations are going to be blurred. So if you'll permit me to geek out for a moment, right? You think about Star Trek: The Next Generation, right? In the actual original series, you have Lieutenant Geordi LaForge with his visor, right? That's an add-on. It helps him to see. In the first and second Star Trek movies, before the most recent reboot, the Next Generation movies, he has these special eyes that have been altered, right? That is a biological alteration, right? So I don't think there's much difference between the visor and the special eyes, right? Some people do, but this is the distinction why I want to say this line between biological and non-biological enhancements might be important. Amongst biological enhancements, we can further distinguish genetic enhancements from non-genetic but still biological enhancements. So Einar has a nice example of using a beta blocker. There's an Olympic athlete, I think he was South Korean if I remember, who's basically turfed and his bronze medal removed. He was an archer because he used a beta blocker to try to make him a little bit more steady. Lots of orchestral players use beta blockers for exactly this reason, right? We take another science fiction example. In Gattaca, when Vincent breaks his legs and has them lengthened for that reason in stress, that's biological, but not genetic, right? So why should genetic enhancements be singled out? They often are in this literature. I'm actually not sure they should, but if I was trying to offer an argument for why they might be different, is that they may be passed on to future generations, but only if that's a germline alteration rather than a somatic cell alteration. It's also possible that they are actually a proxy for another, what I do think might be a morally relevant category, which is that of reversibility, right? That genetic alterations are ordinarily thought of as irreversible. That may not be true in the future. At the moment they are. There are also lots of non-biological and non-genetic alterations that are irreversible. So I think if that's what we're worried about, if the question is reversibility, we should focus on reversibility rather than using this as a proxy. Okay. Second level of distinction is between choosing for ourselves, self-enhancement, versus choosing for others who cannot themselves give full assent. And here the main example, I think, that concerns people is enhancing our children. Within enhancing our children, you can distinguish enhancing before birth versus after birth. An example of after birth would be giving your child human growth hormone. When we're talking about before birth, we can change, for example, the distinction between, and I think this is important, it's been important in my work, enhancing by selection versus enhancing by manipulating already fertilized eggs or already implanted embryos that have become fetuses, right? So you could, and people do, especially single individuals or individuals who are gay and lesbian, when they go to sperm banks to get what's missing, they often do a certain level of shopping, right? There was actually briefly the Center for Germinal Choice, which was supposed to be a Nobel Prize-winning sperm bank. You had to be a Nobel Prize winner. They couldn't get enough Nobel Prize winners, so they surreptitiously lowered the standards dramatically, and if you had a PhD from anywhere, you were in, right? But there's lots of people who apparently care about these things, right? So there is this way of enhancing via selection. As opposed to, at least in the future, it might be possible to genetically manipulate something that's already been fertilized. Right, we already can take off one cell at the 8-cell stage and do PGD on it, for example. We could swap in a different cell, perhaps, in the future. Then we have a distinction in terms of the types of enhancement, what you are trying to enhancement. Some enhancements are Swiss Army knives, in the sense that they can improve your prospects of a child, whatever the child chooses to do with his life. For example, intelligence or disease resistance. Disease resistance is a good example. Most think that is an all-purpose Swiss Army knife enhancement. By contrast, there's other kinds of enhancements that are going to limit options, right? NBA, if you want your child to play by the NBA, you want to be tall. That's going to make it harder for him to work on a submarine, for example, right? The same is true, by the way, about non-biological enhancements. Helping a child improve the skill level at which he or she reads by making her practice is an enhancement that is compatible with many life plans in our society. By contrast, making your child play piano for 5 hours a day is going to foreclose other types of life plans, like sports, like having friends, for example, and limit options in the future. I don't play piano. This is nothing. If you're out there watching this in the outside world, if you play piano, it's great. I have nothing against piano. I just think it may not be compatible with all life plans, that level. Okay, then we can distinguish a reversible versus irreversible enhancements, right? If one's genes are made better by the choice of the genetic material used by your parents, that's usually something that currently, at least, can't be altered in the future. Your genotype is set. Your phenotype may change a little bit. On the other extreme, there are enhancements that are easily undone. For example, an artificial limb, right? I can remove it if I don't want it on there. And in between, there are alterations that might be undone, but only at significant cost, or perhaps redone. So if you have a rhinoplasty, a nose job as an enhancement, and you want to go back to your original nose, I mean, probably the doctor can give a facsimile of your original nose if you had a second one. So that's not quite undoing it, but it's at least kind of redoing it, if you will. Notice the way that this distinction interfaces with the distinction between enhancing yourself versus enhancing your children. In self-enhancement, irreversible enhancements raise special concerns that are paternalistic, that people are going to make poor decisions that they'll later not be able to undo. When it's about enhancing our children, by contrast, and this has a resemblance to other kinds of body alterations like male circumcision or female genital cutting, there is this question that you're making a decision for the child that the child can no longer reduce, which may itself interface with the distinction between Swiss Army knives compatible with many life plans versus choosing a life plan for your child. Okay, then there is a distinction sometimes made in the literature between enhancement versus treatment. Some think that there is a problem with making children better than well, but not with curing diseases. For example, Norm Daniels at Harvard draws a distinction between species-typical functioning and thinks we have an obligation to fund treatments that ensure that there's a level of functioning up to species-typical functioning, but not beyond that. Many, and I think I speak for Elhage and for myself here, are skeptical about this line and think actually they're making a classic baseline problem of the kind we try to cure people of in the first year of law school, right? But there are people out there who think this is a real distinction. Then within this distinction, I think you can actually do a further distinction between enhancements that would bring people to the upper bounds of what people already have versus enhancements that add to the upper bound of humanity as it now stands. So, for example, extending our life to the oldest living person as opposed to extending it much further, or to be really strange about it, adding bat wings to human beings, for example. That would be an enhancement that doesn't happen naturally. So why do people are attracted to this distinction? It's a bit mysterious to me. If I'm trying to be charitable, I think that maybe they're thinking one of three things. One, given that there currently exist human beings who have the trait in question, by seeking it for oneself, you're indisputably still remaining a human being as we now understand the concept. If, by contrast, you could live to 1,000 or grow wings or something that's not part of human nature, maybe you stop being human, and maybe that's important to some people. Second, maybe there's an unfairness in terms of what our genetic endowments already look like. There's a certain moral luck. Since the draw is random, we don't have control about what our parents chose to do or who they chose to marry or what they had to begin with. And doing this is just drawing again from a set deck, if you imagine from poker, like 7 cards stud or something like that, as opposed to shuffling in a completely new deck. So maybe there's a fairness distinction between these two things. And third, maybe the issue here is actually why this is attractive, is it creates a kind of ceiling effect, which relates to a problem involving positional goods that Elhage has written on and I'll mention below. So maybe that's why people are attracted to this, but I think it's relatively under-theorized. And then last, in terms of distinctions about just what kinds of enhancements might be out there, and these are additive, right? We can characterize any enhancement by these 6 characteristics, or maybe 7 or 8 if you use the sub-distinctions. There is a distinction, and this is important for Einer's work, between absolute and positional goods, right? He uses the term transferred benefit and shared costs. Some goods, like being tall, are beneficial usually in a positional sense. They're beneficial because other people don't have them. By contrast, other goods, like immunity from disease, are absolute goods. They're desirable even if everybody else in the world had it. And in a weird way, this kind of mirrors Kant's categorical imperative, the formula, one of the formulas for it. He writes, act only according to that maxim whereby you can at the same time will that it should become a universal law, right? That's his test for the good will. In a sense, the distinction between absolute goods and positional goods are, ask yourself, would you want it if I gave it to you, everybody else had it too, right? If you would still want it, then it's an absolute good. If not, it's only a positional good. Okay. So that taxonomy may not capture every enhancement, but it gets us far along in terms of categorizing things and understanding where the pressure points are. Then we go a little bit from philosophy into the law, right? And here I want to offer a second taxonomy about the way in which it's a simpler one, the law could deal with things. And the first kind of enhancement, the first distinction is permit versus prohibit. And then I want to be a little bit more sophisticated about what I mean by each. So in the permit category, there's no state sanction applied. It could just be that that's the end of it. The state just doesn't sanction it, doesn't do anything else. It's permitted. It's just a regular market good. But we could go further. There are other options here. Theoretically, instead of just permitting it, we could actually make it mandatory. If vaccination is considered a kind of enhancement, we actually do this with some vaccination, at least as a condition for attending school, which is required unless there's a good religious exemption. We could subsidize it, so whether or not it's mandatory, you could also subsidize it. We could require that individuals have insurance, that all insurance coverage have a mandated benefit to cover it. We could do a separate redistribution. We could make it free at a government clinic. We could also make it legal, permit it, but tax it, right? We could tax it separately from other goods and services, a kind of Pigouvian tax, right? In order to make us internalize whatever externalities it produces. We could also tax it in a different way to fund redistribution to people who don't have the enhancement or have bad moral luck, right? That would be another way of doing it. The first way is more like a vice tax, like what we do for suntan beds in the ACA. And by the way, suntanning might itself be considered a kind of enhancement, although one that has cost later in the time stream. And these guys know I like to go to Miami and get a suntan, so this one appeals to me. Finally, we can use nudges and other choice architecture techniques of the Sunstein and Thaler libertarian paternalism, things like speed bumps of psychological pre-screening, waiting or cooling off periods, similar to what we do for adoption, surrogacy, sex reassignment, and I've discussed elsewhere for organ markets. So that's the first set of bundles of interventions. The second are Prohibit. And here I've been a little bit less picky about it, but the state could make something illegal. And within illegal, it could be a criminal offense to buy, sell, or use anabolic steroids, as it currently is now. We could also apply a civil fine. We could also have a notion of disgorgement, that whatever benefit you got, you have to disgorge in return. And in fact, Kurt Vonnegut, one of my favorite authors, imagines in his short story, Harrison Bergeron, which I highly recommend, he imagines a future of 2081 where, quote, everybody was finally equal. They weren't only equal before God and the law, they were equal in every which way. Nobody was smarter than anybody else. Nobody was better looking than anybody else. Nobody was stronger or quicker than anybody else. All this equality was due to the 211th, 212th, and 213th Amendments to the U.S. Constitution and to the unceasing vigilance of agents of the United States Handicapper General, who I understand has permanent funding, so is not upset by government shutdowns, right? No discretionary funding there. And in this dystopic future that Vonnegut imagines, we've got George, whose intelligence is, quote, way above normal, but he has a little mental handicap radio in his ear that he is required by law to wear at all times, and every 20 seconds or so the transmitter would send out some sharp voice to keep people like George from taking unfair advantage of that brain. And then we have a ballerina performing on television who we're told, quote, must have been extraordinarily beautiful because the mask she wore was hideous, and it was easy to see that she was the strongest and most graceful of all the dancers, for her handicaps were as big as those worn by 200-pound men, and so on, right? So this notion that we could try to cancel out enhancement by a kind of disgorgement. So that's legally prohibit. We could also not legally prohibit, but make it impose moral sanction. And that may mean that people who enhance would not be able to enjoy awards, for example, that couldn't be part of the Olympics, like the Korean archer. We could also use it as a bar for entering a competition. We could remove it around. Or we could add asterisks on, greatest hits and Hall of Fame records for people who use enhancements, right? We could use the same rules for adoptions for universities, orchestras, performances, etc., etc. Okay. So that's our legal options. Well, what, if anything, is wrong with enhancement, okay? Starting from a mildly libertarian preference that I wanted to know at least one reason why we want to impose some speed bump. So one possibility is safety risk to the enhanced, right? But again, this is a very heterogeneous territory. Some biological enhancements, like Ritalin use, may pose only minor risks, such as stomach pain and headache. Others, like anabolic steroids, much greater risks. And for many of the enhancements, especially the genetics, we're in a case of Knightian uncertainty. We're uncertain as to the distribution or probabilities, and not just where within a probability distribution a particular risk falls. Other enhancements, like SAT tutoring, pose no safety risk, although they're not costless, and that students pay for the services and they invest their time in it. Of course, many enhancements also promise benefits, the key reason why people want them. When individuals are choosing enhancements for themselves, the justification for legal intervention has to be paternalistic. We think they're going to make a bad decision of cost and benefit. By contrast, when it's about children, we're thinking a lot more in the parens patriae family law way of thinking about this. There is a wrinkle here that I've discussed in my earlier work that I'll just mention here. I've discussed it mostly to creating disabilities, but you can also think about it creating to enhancement. And that is, for enhancement by selection, even if it imposes a safety risk, you may actually think those safety risks can't be easily thought of as harm to the child, because your choice in terms of what gametes you use in selection are going to affect which child comes into existence. So we have to think against the counterfactual. For that child, is there a way to have built that child without the safety risk? So that's just a wrinkle there related to Derek Parfit's non-identity problem. So again, I think these are realistic concerns, but they have to be scaled a little bit to the type of enhancement, and probably it's a small subset of enhancements that reach this constraint. A second concern has to do with distribution and inequality, and this is at the heart of Harrison Bergeron, and also, as my countryman Leonard Cohen put it, everybody knows the fight was fixed, the poor stay poor, the rich get rich, that's how it goes, and everybody knows. He's a gravelier voice than I do, so he does it even better, right? The idea is that the risk cuts across essentially, Artie White didn't think she was going to get serenaded today, right? But it's a special occasion, right? We have to serenade Einar a little bit, right? These risks cut across essentially all forms of enhancement, right? From cosmetic surgery to SAT tutoring. Maybe it's a little bit more salient as to positional goods because they're desired because they can enhance. But there are other ways of doing this too. So the obvious legal intervention that deals with this particular concern is to prohibit the enhancement in question. But that's pretty strong medicine. We could also diminish this concern by subsidizing it, right? The state could require all insurers to cover LASIK, eye surgery, Ritalin, and to be provocative purposefully, breast augmentation or anabolic steroid use, have that required by law to be covered, so there's no inequality in terms of access. It could also require all SAT tutoring companies to engage in need-blind admissions into their program or produce a fee waiver system similar to what we do for university admission. And we could imagine these subsidies could be more progressive or less progressive depending on the way in which we want to do them. We could also make these subsidies free for the taking, or we could actually make them mandated, right? So libertarians, at least when it comes to modification, may have a problem with this, but we could make them both subsidized and mandated as a way to avoid inequality problems, because then we'd be sure that everybody could get them, right? We do this with education. If you think of education as an enhancement, that's exactly what we do there. And a point that's sometimes overlooked here is that although enhancements raise this problem of inequality, they also in some ways solve a different problem of inequality that Tala averred to. And that is that we have moral luck in the distribution of our talents currently, right? And the question is, can we use enhancement as a way of trying to overcome that moral luck, to make the distribution of our talents more equal to begin with? And again, there's a question of whether you think this would be a good thing or a bad thing. Certainly, Harrison Bergeron, Vonnegut's view is that this is a bad thing. But maybe if we're leveling up rather than leveling down, it would be a good thing if we were all equally talented and we all have lots and lots of talents. Okay. A third concern is the coercion of voluntary enhancements. And again, the idea here is that if enhancements are not mandatory, even though you might have, even if they're subsidized, you have the option of taking one. But if you fail to enhance, you're going to suffer. So if we have a population of 100 identically situated individuals, if 50 of those individuals choose to enhance, they increase their share of the zero-sum goods in a society. And the other individuals in the society must either themselves enhance in order to compete. And the result is either a new equilibrium where everyone enhances, or at least many choose to enhance who would otherwise not choose to enhance otherwise. In some ways, this is a dynamic similar to concerns about minimum wage. We want to fix the minimum wage so we don't have people, a vicious circle of people underbidding one another. So I call this somewhat oxymoronically coerced voluntary enhancement, right? Because the enhancements are voluntary, but the dynamic it produces are somewhat coerced. And Chatterjee gives a good real-life example of pilots taking donepezil, performed better in emergencies than those on placebos, and the implications this might have. He writes, if these results were reliable and significant, should pilots be expected to take such a medication? Can airline executives require this of pilots? Would they offer financial incentives to pilots willing to take these medications? Will the public, fearful of flying, pay more for these kinds of co-pilots? Closer to home, should post-call residents take modafinil to attenuate deficits in sustained attention brought on by sleep deprivation in the hospital? So I think these are very interesting examples, but they disrupt my moral intuition to some extent. Yes, there's a moral problem, moral issue here, but is there a moral problem? Imagine that pilots who took the drug in question were really better pilots. Why wouldn't we want the competitive coercive dynamic to take hold if the enhancement was costless and safe? If you were to try to imagine what the protest of one of these pilots might sound like, it might be something like, quote, "I have a right not to enhance and improve the safety of passengers. And the fact that it makes me a worse pilot, it makes it more likely that my plane will crash, that should not count against me in competing for this job," unquote, right? So maybe I'm a bit hard-hearted here, but I don't understand why we would give this a lot of credence in this example. If the same pilot said, let's take a non-biological enhancement, flight simulator time. I haven't spent as much time in flight simulator as that guy. He's obviously a better pilot, better trained, better instincts. But I still think you should be able to ignore that. You should have to ignore that when deciding whether to hire me. I think most of us would have a reaction against that kind of reasoning. So the question is whether the biological, non-biological line is doing a lot of work here that might be problematic in terms of the analysis. And if, like me, you think the biologic, non-biologic line, and I think like Elhague too, is actually a tenuous one and a hard one to defend, then I think it might disrupt our ideas here. There is another kind of objection that I associate with Michael Sandel related to what I call the love of randomness. My colleague Michael Sandel at Harvard seems to love randomness, right? He thinks in football in particular, the telos, to use the Aristotelian term, football and other competitive sports is inequality, the random distribution of talent. But that's really just a convention of the way our current system is set up, that random forces about who got what decide matches. But there are other random forces not about talent, like the direction of the wind or how grass was cut on a particular day that would still be relevant. There would still be chance involved in football. But to grant devil's advocate, let's grant to him that something would be lost if all players were allowed to use safe and free performance-enhancing drugs. We're imagining they're safe, we're imagining they're free to factor out these other objections. Okay, so let's take a look at me for a second, okay? So do you think I could play football? I mean, judge me a little bit harshly here, right? I'm like 5'9.5" on a good day, right? Right now, and I know there'll be a day when I watch this video and I will regret saying this, I'm about 161 pounds, but I'll be much larger at some point in my life, I'm sure, right? There's no way I could ever play football. Let's put that aside. Imagine there was a killer gym routine out there, 325 days a week, 5 hours a day, I train and I become super Cohen, right? I become a much bigger sense of myself and I can play football. I'm talented enough. Now imagine there's also, that's weightlifting Cohen in one version of the world. Imagine there's a matter of moral luck here, right? Some people's bodies will respond better to weightlifting regimes than others. So even on this, if you'll pardon the pun, sweat equity theory, right? There is a difference here in terms of this. But imagine now that there is a pill out there that does exactly the same thing. Why is it that we think that weightlifting Cohen should be deserve the honorifics that pill-popping Cohen does not, right? Well, one answer is maybe one earned it and the other didn't. I said there's a problem there. But imagine the pill involved is extremely expensive. It's so expensive that pill-popping Cohen has to work a part-time job that's just as strenuous as weightlifting. He moves things around, but unfortunately doesn't build his body. 325 days of the year, 5 hours a day to afford the pill, right? So the same amount of effort has gone in. Why is it that one is so much better than the other? And if it turns out that pill-popping Cohen has to work harder than workout Cohen, why is it that one deserves it, not the other? And if it turns out that pill-popping Cohen has to work less hard, it's more efficient, why do we want these transaction costs of people getting involved? So I have other things I say on this, but I am concerned about Sandel's view of this. I'm running out of time, so I do want to share with you a little bit about Elhague's take on this and where I think he does an important addition to the debate in particular, which is this notion of externalities, okay? So skipping down for a moment, I have to talk more about this in Q&A or outside. You can read it in the actual paper, right? Owing no doubt to part of his background in law and economics, and the fact that many of the people who write in these areas are somewhat hostile to economic thinking about the world, right? Einer has suggested that the chief problem with enhancement lies in the way it creates externality for others. He writes, so this is again, I hope his publisher doesn't blame me for quoting him a little bit there. He writes, Situations where we cannot trust individuals to weigh the benefits and costs of their biological interventions because those effects are external to them, that is where we have to be worried. In particular, sometimes part or all of the benefits are transferred to them from others, or part of all the costs are shifted from them onto others. As a result, individuals who consider only the benefits and costs they personally experience will be agreeing to biological interventions that impose a net harm, including a net harm on themselves once one considers that other individuals will undergo similar interventions that inflict a net harm back. In sports competition, the benefits of a beta blocker reflect a transfer of benefits from one to the other. Only one athlete can win each Olympic medal. If one athlete wins by taking a beta blocker, that merely transfers that benefits to the using athlete from the non-using athlete. The use of the beta blocker may seem like it has a large individual benefit to the user, but it creates a zero total benefit to all set of persons. So the notion is here, in some contexts like that, as opposed to classical music, where there is an externalized benefit, if you're talking about a positional good, and you are generating positive or negative externalities, that is problematic. If, on the other hand, you are generating an absolute benefit, there are both positive and negative externalities. They have to be considered. And in cases where the negative externalities are greater than the positive externalities, that is the place for regulation. So I think that's right, and part of this project is to try to understand, is there anything else wrong with enhancement? And the last thing I'll just say, and I'm just going to mention this real quick, we can talk more, is I think something that hasn't been thought of enough, and is maybe the newest thing I say here, is try to understand why people want enhancement. In particular, when we talk about enhancing our children, I think there is a real problem if we think we're making our children better off. We're not. We're doing it at least by selection of gametes, for example, but maybe some of these other kinds too, like genetic manipulation or manipulation of a fetus. We are not making our children better off, a child better off. We're replacing our children with better children, quote unquote, or children that we think are better, right? This is not about preventing harm. This is not about giving gain to our children. This is not about the way in which we think parents appropriately act normally to try and make their children better off. This is instead something that is much more akin to the eugenics movement. It is to say, the world is better off if instead of this child, I had that child. Now again, you may have a theory that enhancement is desirable even on that ground, non-person affecting principle approach, or what I've called reproductive externalities elsewhere. But I want to press on to you that this is a much more difficult set of grounds than is often normally thought, and they are taking cover from the political theory idea. Everybody wants their children to be good, everybody wants their children to be happy, everybody wants their children to be better off. It's a much less clear thing whether we want to replace our children with other children. If we wanted that, we could all use sperm banks, we could all use donor gametes, we could all basically make these kinds of decisions genotypically. The fact that many of us don't suggests to me that there may be a problem with this kind of thinking, but I'll stop it there and we can talk more.